Okay, brilliant. So all being well, we're now, oh, 1 sec, sorry. Technical issues. We just have to wait for the Facebook. Okay, brilliant. So yeah, as I say, all being well, we are now recording live and also streaming live on Facebook. So welcome to those watching the recording or watching us on Facebook. You're also joining us towards a Global Wellbeing Economies Alliance pre-webinar this evening. I'm Flo Shalom from the Network of Wellbeing, as the people on Zoom that are joining us know. This is Katherine Trebeck from the Wellbeing Economy Alliance. So just to very briefly introduce the webinar itself, the Network of Wellbeing are running a series of, at the moment, monthly webinars with people that are really active in the wellbeing world, just so that you can get to know different people and organisations' work and really get an insight into all of the really exciting things that are happening in the world of wellbeing. And I think that Katherine is a really great example of a kind of mover and shaker in the wellbeing world, so to speak. I've known Katherine, yeah, for a while now, since she attended our Building Wellbeing Together weekend last year at Hawkwood College. And she's currently the research lead for the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, and she's previously had a lot of experience, 8 years working at Oxfam in a variety of different roles, looking at how the economy impacts upon social justice and sustainability issues. And she's also just recently completed a book, which we were just talking about. So congratulations, Katherine, on completing.
It's the bags under the eyes is testament to that.
Yeah, and that book is going to be released next year, and I'm just going to check my notes to get the title right. It's the Economics of Arrival, Ideas for a Grown-Up Economy. Already from the title, I'm really excited about the book's release and look forward to reading it. So I'm just going to, we really want to make sure to have an interactive discussion with you guys this evening. We really appreciate you taking the time to join Katherine and I. And so I'm just going to briefly read out a few more introductions on the Zoom chat to see a little bit more about who's joining us, and then we'll dive into some of the questions we have for Katherine this evening. If that's all right, Katherine.
Yes, yeah, of course. It's wonderful seeing all these. I could just happily spend the evening look at all, all these different people scrolling through the chat. It's amazing.
Yeah, no, it is. It's really brilliant to have so many amazing people joining us. So thank you, guys. And just to say, if you're watching on Facebook, my colleague Roger is helping monitor the Facebook chat. So even if you're not joining us on Zoom, Roger can input some of your comments and questions into Zoom as well. So Safi Price, lovely to see you here. Safi has said, I work with our local authority and I'm really interested in finding ways of encouraging our city to look at wellbeing measures rather than only focusing on economic factors. Brilliant. I hope that you're in the right place and that we're going to cover a lot of relevant topics. And Deborah Johnson says, I have come to the conclusion that the existing systems are no longer serving humanity in equitable ways, so a new paradigm is inevitable. Yeah, very true, Deborah. And that's, I think, what's brought a lot of us here this evening, actually. I can see that a lot of you guys have contributed your comments on, on where you're joining us from. And I'll try and read through and touch on some more of them later. But for now, I think we'd like to dive into the first of our questions for Katherine, if that's okay. And Katherine, did you want to say a brief hello before we dive into the questions? Because I realise
I'll just turn off the chat, otherwise I'll be completely addicted looking to all the comments and seeing where everyone's come through. And it's lovely to see some familiar names there too. I'm not sure if you can tell, but I can't see people's faces. I'm just looking at the lovely Flo. So sorry not to be able to sort of say hello to you almost in a personal sense, but I'm really, really thrilled to be here. And actually, Flo, you forgot where we first met, which was at the Nessie Forum in Malaga, which is one of the leading organisations really coming together to create this Wellbeing Economy Alliance. So I'll talk about that shortly. So do you want me to do a little bit more about?
Yeah, no, thank you for reminding where we actually met. Of course, it was at Nessie in Malaga.
Yeah, this is almost our anniversary now.
Yeah, yeah.
It's a year ago.
That's beautiful. Well, I'm happy to be spending it in this way in such a lovely conversation. So welcome to those just joining us. I see Mira has just joined from Brussels and Gail from Vermont in the USA. And thank you so much, guys, for sharing a bit about your backgrounds and where you're joining from. It's really, like Katherine says, great to have you with us. So the first question, so we've got a few questions for you, Katherine, that, like I say, people voted for on the Facebook event. And the first one, and one of the most popular, was quite a broad one, but really speaks to the work you're doing, I think, is how can we shift our economy so it's better for people and for planet?
Yeah, so I mean, this is the key question, isn't it? I mean, this is, I suspect, why most people are spending an hour on a Tuesday evening or a Tuesday morning, depending on where you are, tuning into a Zoom call to chat about it. I mean, this is what drives so many different organisations and activists and communicators and thinkers and speakers and policymakers. And yet, sadly, they're still butting up against this wider system that's going in the opposite direction. And I confess to you, I'm based in Glasgow, but I'm down in London at the moment, at my friend's house, who owns this beautiful art behind me. So I can't make any claim to have as good taste in art as my friend does. And I was a bit hesitant to read the papers today because there's been another royal baby, and I was a bit dubious about opening up the newspapers and seeing just this flurry of fawning. But it was quite extraordinary just looking through some of the headlines in the papers today, and just to give you, I mean, just one day newspaper, I think, says all we need to know about how the economic system is functioning and the harm it's doing to communities and individuals. So some of the headlines were around studies talking about these unprecedented levels of loneliness amongst millennials. It's not older people that are the loneliest, it's young people and the health impacts of that. Talking about the highest ever levels of 0-hour contracts in the UK today, unprecedented level numbers of food parcels were handed out over the last year, rising levels of obesity, almost 80 homeless people died over winter, doctors feeling burnt out, a think tank saying that the UK is not prepared for the next recession, and then on the environmental sphere, which often gets less media coverage, plastics being found in the Great Australian Bight. And if you imagine a sort of Australia that shape, it's that really southern bit, sort of south of Adelaide, and if you kept sort of sailing, you'd hit Antarctica, so way to the south, where there's very few people, and the plastics being found in that area as well. That's just one day's newspaper, and one paper as well. And it's this litany of examples of how our economic system is just crushing down and hurting communities in such a profound way. And then I picked up another paper when I was waiting for a meeting, and there was a columnist in the Financial Times, and I won't mention his name because he's quite good usually, but he was saying, what are people complaining about? We're in unprecedented levels of prosperity. People should be saying they're happy. Poverty has come down. But his argument was the world is at a better place than it's ever been, and it's quite extraordinary because he didn't mention the environment, and we have world leaders saying that Obama, one of his speeches towards the end of his time in office was the climate change is an existential crisis, and that's ignoring all the other environmental impacts and species loss and so on. So I think the evidence is there, and those of us who sort of get sucked in by the tyranny of averages and looking at GDP figures or looking at raw employment figures and celebrating unemployment being down when at the same time we know 0-hour contracts are up, are missing. They're just really, I think, boxed in to this old mindset of what the economy is really about. They're looking at these, what people might call the economic fundamentals, but not looking at fundamental human needs. And so in terms of how we start shifting, I think the first step is to start asking those questions about how are all these sort of symptoms, I'd say, these collateral damage that we see all around us in different manifestations, how are they linked to the nature of the economic model? And I've got a young nephew at the moment. He's 5, and a couple of years ago he was at that age where he was always asking why, but why. And I'm sure all of you have got young kids in your lives will find that familiar. But in a way it's quite lovely, because those young kids, when they're always asking why, they're doing root cause analysis. They may not know it, but they are. And that's I think the first step in starting to sort of look upstream, look at those root causes. Why is it that we've got young people feeling lonelier than ever? Why is obesity rising? Why are doctors feeling burnt out? And so start asking those questions. How is this all connected? And then you start opening your eyes, and I suspect folks on this call are already there, to understand the nature of the economic model or the economic system. And you hear that term bandied about a lot. And what I mean by that is what our economy is purposed to do, what it's geared up to deliver. And currently that's all about more and more gross domestic product. And from that flows incentive systems, the way we design tax, the way we remunerate, how we price different things, what subsidies we offer, what sectors we subsidize, how extractive we are, how we marketize different services. All those sort of questions go into that, that complex picture, that hairy picture of how the economy operates. And so the sooner we can start to understand those different levels, and there's quite a well-known chart where they talk about multi-level system perspective, where it's the lower level of that, and I don't mean that in an important sense, but you have the micro, the niche level, the activities of individual organizations or individual businesses or individuals within their own households, sort of that little bubbling up of loads of different activities, that niche tiny level, the micro. And then above that you have the meso level, and that's the regime, the policy context that sort of shapes the terrain. And then above that you have that landscape macro level. And the key thing is to understand how they all fit together in a good way and a bad way. So what's going on at the macro level, and for example, what the economy is geared up to deliver in terms of GDP, can really shape and constrain what policymakers, for example, at the regime level are doing. And that in turn constrains and shapes what individuals at the micro level are up to. But also up the other direction a lot. And this is why, to move us into the sort of the question about the Wellbeing Economy Alliance itself, there is so much good, amazing, quite extraordinary activity happening at the micro level. And the key thing is to start communicating those messages to policymakers, saying we know what a different economy looks like. We know what an economy that serves people and planet entails, because we see it in microcosm. We see these chinks of light. And the idea is to sort of, one, we need to amplify them so people can replicate and be inspired, but also encourage policymakers to step into that. So I think one of the key things is getting on with our own activities, but also reaching out and making those connections. And that's why I think organisations like NOW are so extraordinarily important in keeping those conversations around why does the economy need to change? What is it about the economic system? And how to connect up the amazing work that's happening to a conversation about changing the purpose of the economy, changing the purposes of businesses, and really encouraging and cultivating the sort of activities that we need to flourish. And then that will start to ricochet up and down that multi-level system.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Katherine, for that really informative answer, because I think that, yeah, like you say, it can be somewhat overwhelming to look at all of the challenges that are being faced, like you say, just through reading one day's newspaper headlines, or not even the headlines, what's hidden behind the headlines, so to say. And yet there is also a lot of inspiring activism going on, albeit at perhaps often at a more grassroots level. And so I do think there's a really powerful role to be played in terms of kind of amplifying and connecting what is happening. I know that I know that recently actually you've made the transition to become the lead researcher at the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, and that is an organisation kind of at the forefront of looking at these kind of questions. So it would be brilliant actually if you could just briefly introduce what the Alliance is, and also let us know a bit about your theory of change and what you think, what the approach is there.
Okay, and it's a real privilege to be able to join this webinar at the moment, because the Wellbeing Economy Alliance is just starting. It's really, this is what's a good analogy? Oh, so imagine a sheep just being born, and the little lamb, and it's just starting to work out how to stand up, and looking around, and realizing where it is, and working out how to run. And so we're at that very, very early stage, and it's really wonderful to be able to share our emerging thinking that's ready. So we're very open-minded to take advice and ideas and suggestions. So none of this is definitively set in stone. We're going to try this process of fail quickly, fail early, and try to be as adaptive. And so, yes, I've spent 8.5 years working for Oxfam, an organisation I'm extraordinarily proud of all the work they do, and I'm taking years without pay effectively to try and sort of connect Oxfam's work and help support this idea of the Wellbeing Economy Alliance as notionally their research lead, but inevitably, as those folks who are in small organisations will know, in the startup phase, it's a case of all hands to the tiller. The theory of change, I think it was Deborah who said in one of the chats that I noticed earlier that the new paradigm is inevitable, and I entirely agree. I think that the science is so profoundly terrifying with what's happening in a climate sense, but also the political consequences of people's alienation from the current economic system. That change is already happening, and more change is coming. And the question is, how passive are we going to be in letting that sort of growing crisis and the fallout from that wash over us, and all the terrible, disastrous, catastrophic consequences? Or can we be proactive in responding to that and actually creating the sort of paradigm shift that we need, to a paradigm that is about people and planet? And that's what we call the wellbeing economy. And it's sort of I should say that the wellbeing is the sort of the adjective on the economy. So it's idea of an economy that creates and supports human and ecological wellbeing. And so in terms of the theory of change of this growing organisation, and I might even step back a bit to tell you a tiny bit about the history, if I can be so indulgent, Flo, if that's okay, it's the coming together of several organisations. One is NESI, where Flo and I met a year ago, and that's a New Economy Social Innovation Forum, and that's based in Malaga. And they had this time last year a huge gathering in Malaga, and it was sort of people referring to it as the Davos of the new economy. And it was really sort of taking up this challenge that people want to connect more and collaborate more. And yet when we go back to our desks in our day jobs, so often we end up competing. And so, yes, people want to find space to connect and collaborate. And so NESI was born of that, the need, I think, to try and link people together and do actions where we're holding hands, rather than sort of putting in separate funding bids or working on duplicate or sort of disconnected activities. At the same time, I was involved in some conversations with some academics, a group called the Alliance for Sustainable Prosperity for All, and also there was an emerging group of people from largely based in the US called Leading for Wellbeing, and they did a consultation. They spoke to, I think, over 1,000 people across Europe and the US and other places, really saying what we need is a new memorandum in terms of a strategy to take a new economy, transform the economy. And we need to mimic the strategy that the Powell Memorandum represented in the 70s, which was essentially, to use that American term, the neoliberal playbook. Here are the sorts of things that we need to do to boot out Keynesianism and to bring about they wouldn't have used the term neoliberalism, but what we now know as that economic model. And so learning from that, what was effective. And one, it was about having a coherent story or set of stories or narratives and terminologies. And we're going to come back to that later on. But also connecting people up, working with people. So at the moment, there is extraordinary work happening in all sorts of places, but it's relatively disconnected, but also it's happening despite rather than because of the current economic system. So we need to flip that on its head so we have a system supporting it. It's about creating a vanguard, creating a sort of a movement around all this amazing work. And so the idea of bringing those groups together and bringing in other organisations, the challenge was that this disconnection and this amazing work happening but not necessarily linking up together allows that divide and conquer. Into that gap allows business as usual just to carry on. And it also allows folk, or means that people can feel relatively isolated, burnout and exhaustion, and feel that they're not part of a wider change. And so sort of space for optimism, and that we can build this wider movement and this sort of surge of change and activity. So it does allow a situation where good things happen, inspiring things happen, the sort of change we need happens, but it's despite rather than because of the system. And so what we want to do is a little bit tactically learn from what's happened in previous shifts of major sort of economic systems in the sort of Western world. And so develop new stories, working with others, because a lot of work happening on that, and so really being mindful of all that amazing activity. Also build together what we refer to as a coherent body of theory and practice. And that's something I'll be leading on. I'm still trying to get my head around what does that look like in practice. What will be useful? How far do we need to go in terms of synthesis? And any ideas or suggestions are most welcome. And in a way, and this is probably a desperately inappropriate metaphor, but a bit like the pit team in Formula One racing, running around and supporting the sort of the team, the driver in the car. And we want to be the ones supporting what's happening. And so the nickname for the sort of tiny little staff team of WeAll, of which I'm the second member, and there will be another one joining next month as a network manager, another one joining a few months later as comms manager. We're referring to ourselves as the amplification team. When we're not wanting to be the rock stars by any means, what we're wanting to do is amplify and communicate and connect the work that's already happening. So in a way, the pit team analogy, sort of helping the work that's happening. In a practical sense, what we're envisaging doing, and as I say, completely, very much evolving, is setting up 7 different clusters, of which the research cluster that I've already mentioned will be one. Another one will be around businesses. Another round will be around cities and places. And Safi, I think in Leicester, maybe she was. Be great to have you involved in that and connect you to the other cities that we're working with. And actually, there's Simon, I think, is here as well. So Safi and Simon should connect. One around sort of faith and values, and what is it to deliver meaning and purpose to folks' lives in a world and economy that's all about consumerism. One around bringing to, as I've said, the academics and the sort of thinking and the grey literature in think tanks. Another one around what we're calling institutional innovators, and that's really for want of a better term, but there are a lot of folks who would understand the sort of questions that we're asking, who are working in very, very big establishment, maybe mainstream organisations, and like the OECD or the IMF or the World Bank. And that can be a really tough gig to be working in those sorts of organisations, but my goodness, we need them to be in there, helping transition those sorts of agencies. And so we just kept, this wasn't almost strategic, we kept meeting people and thought, we've got to be able to work with these individuals. So we set up this stream. And then the more we've thought about it and the more we've understood and spoken to experts about how change happens, is really learning the strategic importance of that insider role. And so we're really wanting to sort of help those folks within those organisations take their organisations on a journey and help them just not feel so lonely and exhausted, as often happens. The other 2 groups are civil society group, and one that I've been working on for many months at Oxfam, is to bring together a group of governments, states and regions, in a short way of describing it, almost as an alternative G7, essentially saying that the heroes or the champions of development, the geopolitical power and influence in the 21st century cannot be those countries who are powerful simply because of their big GDP. And then you look at where, you know, the entry ticket to the G7 or the G20, it is how big's your GDP. So we need new champions, and we need to support those champions, because none of them are perfect. They're a long way off, and there's a lot of inconsistency in their work. And so we want to really support those, bring together those group of governments, and we're making really slow progress, but really nice headway, working with countries like Scotland, like Costa Rica, like New Zealand, like Slovenia, and I can perhaps come back to that later. They're the clusters. Mm-hmm. The long-term vision is also to build a global citizens movement. There are so many organisations, but also individuals who are just realising, and you all be familiar with this, I suspect, that the current system is not sustainable in a social environmental sense. And some folks are turning to pretty toxic or negative outlets for that. But not others are just trying to do something small in their own spheres of influence, in their own locality. And we want to really help folks, wherever they are, feel that they're part of this bigger movement. So we're really thinking about how do we create a global citizens movement. So that's exciting. I'll stop there, because that's loads back.
No, I mean, but I think it's really an exciting time to be having this conversation, because like you say, it's at the beginning of WeAll, which is the abbreviation of Wellbeing Economy Alliance.
I should have said that.
It's the beginning of WeAll as an organisation, and therefore, like, it's a really great time to be having this conversation, because speaking of building networks, I can see the chat box is kind of being really interactive, which is brilliant and much appreciated. And there's some amazing people listening and joining the webinar today. And I think it's really important to kind of have these conversations and create these connections and join together.
Camilla from Brazil. Hi, Camilla.
Yeah. So and like I mentioned earlier, we do want to make this a kind of interactive discussion. So I think that it would be great to kind of bring some of your guys' voices in more into our discussion. Yes. And we were going to move on to a kind of final question for Katherine, but we can also make this a bit of an interactive question about what are the most important steps we need to take to kind of build this alliance. Of course, there's going to be lots of, like you've said, Katherine, through WeAll's work, you're focusing on these different sectors, of these different segments of work, and also kind of different scales in a way. And I think there's lots to do, but what are the ways that we can kind of work together? And in a sense, WeAll is kind of formed as a response to that question, yes, so to speak. But yeah, it would be great to hear what you think of that, and also what others think of that, and we'll try and bring a few of your guys' amazing voices into the chat as well.
I would love that. So I'll try and be quick here. I was saying to Flo just before we started the Zoom call, that almost, if you can imagine when you're sort of baking a cake, you think, okay, we need to bake this sort of cake. We sort of know the sort of change we need to see, and then how various the changes that required for that. But we're for WeAll as a practical contribution to that, we're just getting the ingredients out and putting them on the work surface. We're not yet at that stage. So you are really part of the conversation at that very, very early stage. So it's really, really exciting to have people, you know, hearing this and responding. And I'm really excited to sort of see what's coming out through the chat and the exercise that we'll be doing in a minute. So in several ways to just, I guess, get involved and join the journey. One is through your organisations, and just that introduction that Flo that you ran through some of the people who are on the call. There is amazing work happening, isn't there? You know, people here, part of the community. So connecting those organisations, bringing them into WeAll. Hopefully we can connect you to others. Hopefully we can really help amplify your work. So where we're up to now in terms of that onboarding of other organisations is we're not quite ready. we're recruiting a network manager who will start in a fortnight. So we've got a very temporary website, and I feel a little bit hesitant to say go and look at it, because we haven't even decided our logo. It's so temporary and under construction. But if you do go on there, sort of close your eyes to the design and how it's under construction at the moment. It's not yet finalized. It's a holding place. So please come back to it. We know that people, if they go to a website and they don't like it, they rarely return, but please go back.
People would still really love to see it, Chris.
That's so lovely.
Yeah.
What's on there though is a sign up link. So go in there. It's wellbeingeconomy.org.
And just a very practical point, we'll include the link in the follow-up email, and for those watching on Facebook, we'll share on Facebook, so don't feel the need to immediately note down the link. We'll send it in follow-up.
That's fabulous. So sign up to that. And what we're really wanting to be a very open and accountable and accessible organisation. And we're envisaging doing monthly webinars, where we've had a few already, and they've been really well populated, where we just update people on what we're up to. People can feed in ideas. The sort of connections, as you can see in the chat, is already working. So sign up to that, and you'll get the notifications of what we're up to. Put in your diaries coming to Malaga next April. We're going to have these biannual New Economy Social Innovation Forums. So be ready to come to Malaga next year and meet people in person and be part of that announcement and the building of the momentum and linking with others. Bring your organisation to that. And then I guess more generally, not just about WeAll, but is the more we start asking those questions of, that a 3-year-old would, that root cause analysis, but why are these things happening? And not letting that orthodoxy go unchallenged, not letting us be told by a columnist in the Financial Times that things are fine because debt is coming down and unemployment's up and numbers of poverty is down. When you actually look at things like the ethical poverty line, we know that actually we're at unprecedented levels of poverty measured by anything more than just $1.90 a day. And I can come back to that later. And I guess, so just be part of it, get involved at this early stage and be part of the conversations. I'll stop there because I want to hear people's.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. And I think it's great to have that emerging network to be a part of and connect with. And I think even just kind of hosting this discussion, you can already see that there's so many people kind of really passionate and proactively doing work in this area already. So we're gonna have a brief practical kind of exercise, but I really would love to just say hello and thank you to all of you for joining this webinar with Katherine this evening, and just kind of maybe reference a few of the comments that have been made. For example, I know that Indra is joining us from Alternative UK, and I think her colleague Pat as well, who I know have been doing a lot of interesting work on alternative economics, and they've put some links in the chat discussion.
Great.
I know that Camilla, who you mentioned, has joined, and she's been running a kind of series of interviews called Not the Truth, which is like looking into this kind of these ideas behind, okay, what is actually going on behind the headlines if we're not being, given the full picture in mainstream media always. And I know that she interviewed Roger from the Network of Wellbeing, and I think she's going to interview you as well, Katherine, which is great. There's so, I mean, it's really brilliant to see you guys connecting with each other as well, because I think that's one of the things that you have touched on, Katherine, like the importance of kind of supporting each other and networking together. I know Simon said that he's currently working on implementing practical solutions and prototyping wellbeing economies, so people can get in touch with him, and he's put
that's amazing work that's happening in Johannesburg. So really encourage people to have a look at Simon's projects. They're brilliant.
Mira's made an interesting comment earlier on about how sometimes we can replicate some of the challenges that exist in mainstream in the mainstream economy, and that often change makers can be at kind of the risk of burnout, and that that there is a kind of need to really focus on the well-being aspect of creating the new economy as well. I'm sorry to kind of paraphrase your comment there, Mira.
What's that, Mira?
Yeah,
I so agree. Just as an anecdote to that, we've had face-to-face team meeting these last few days, and we were 10 o'clock on Sunday night, ironically working out our work-life balance policies.
Right.
We failed straight away. I hope that doesn't reflect how we're going to be.
Yeah. But I think that I think that in a sense, like, I think it's a really important point, and that there is, in terms of kind of the connections and building the kind of connections of care, and that's why building networks are so important, because it really helps to kind of replenish and remind you of why you're doing the work that you're doing, and kind of motivate you further on. And not to say that we should all be working at 10 o'clock on a Sunday night, but then it's good to have these discussions and be open about, you know, what are the things we can do to be a sustainable movement in the long term as well, I think.
Yes, entirely. And I very much agree. I think the more we feel that we're part of something bigger than ourselves, the sense of finding our place and our niche in that as well. We don't have to be everything. We can recognize where our energy, where our skill set, where our spheres of influence are, and dive into that and be knowing that others are taking care of some of the other changes that we need to see. And I think that's one of the key aspects of these sorts of you know, good discussions like now is hosting, but also the sort of what we hope to do at the Wellbeing Economy Alliance that we all.
Yeah, for sure. And I see the rules has been mentioned in the chat discussion, which is a brilliant organisation. I'd recommend people checking out and rethinking economics. So there's a lot of existing initiatives and projects that are going on that are really doing amazing work in this way. And I guess that's what you were talking about earlier, Katherine, in terms of these levels and the fact that there is a lot of work going on, and it's about how when there is this work going on, can we kind of integrate and connect and work together so that we can try and make that shift happen at a larger scale, which is what we're all working towards. And I think just on that note, just to kind of continue the discussion, we were hoping to have a kind of brief practical exercise before we move on to Q&A from you guys, looking at how we could explain some of these more complex ideas to people that maybe aren't so proactively involved as a lot of you guys are in these discussions. So maybe I'll hand over to Katherine to just briefly introduce that exercise, and we'll just invite, and I'll try and keep a tab of your guys' great contributions in the chat while Katherine introduces.
So this sort of question or query, and I mean very sincerely that what you come up with in the next few minutes, we will hungrily take into the work we're doing and incorporate into what's happening, what we're trying to do with WeAll. And one of the challenges is to make some of these concepts and the complexity of them simple and understandable for folks who aren't steeped in these sorts of conversations, who are obviously affected in the precariousness of their livelihoods, or being affected by climate change, or being feeling that their lives, they're not able to control them, or so on. But there's a communication task, and I'm very conscious. I'm a bit of a policy wonk and a sort of academic by background, and I often slip into a lot of the sort of language that's jargonistic and it's over complex. And what we're wanting to do at WeAll is, in the coming months and years, work with creatives and artists and writers and authors to really help us communicate these concepts and also the aspiration of them. So it's not just about what's wrong with the current system, but really help people feel confident that the sort of change that all of us are working for in our different ways is desirable, but also feasible. And I was having a really interesting conversation this morning with talking to an organisation, really recognising that folks whose livelihoods are dependent on what they refer to as brownfield sectors, it's quite understandable that they might hold on for dear life to that current way of life. So we need to be able to describe how a wellbeing economy or regenerative economy, or whatever you want to call it, can work, but also can be better than the current state of affairs, and how it will benefit people's lives, how they'll feel it, how it will look like. So what I would love is a sense of what sort of words resonate with you, but also might resonate with your taxi driver, or the person who pulls your beers at the pub, or the person who cuts your hair. And how people who are not doing this full time, just really ideas and thoughts.
Thanks, Katherine. And I think that we'll just take that opportunity to just invite you guys to maybe have just a short reflection, and obviously we're in this webinar format, but you can imagine that if we were all in the same room, you might just kind of take a little breath and maybe like make some notes to yourself. I know that I'm going to read through some of the amazing messages you guys have shared on the chat, but also just reflect on that question that Katherine shared in terms of how would you explain some of these concepts in an accessible way, and maybe if you just even if a word or a short phrase comes to mind, and just on a practical note to let you know, we will be able to download this chat discussion you guys have been having after the call, and because it's been so rich, I'm going to see if there's a way that we can kind of share that with you all in the follow-up email as well. I'll look into that, but we definitely will be able to download it, and I'll look at a way to share it with you all, and I'll definitely will be sharing it with Katherine afterwards so she can feed it into her work at WeAll. So thank you for all of your comments, and even though we're not able to read all of them out, rest assured they will all be read and paid close attention to during and after the call. So yeah, I'll just leave us for a minute or so to kind of reflect on that question of accessible ways to bring people into this discussion. And if you have any thoughts on that, please share in the chat box. So there's some nice suggestions coming in already. Roger says there's more to life than shopping, indeed, and that can be a great place to start the conversation in terms of people's consumption habits and how we connect to consumption. And then Josh had said about the smart economy rather than the dumb economy. I think that's quite
I like that.
To engage people. Gail has said, shifting the thinking to realize communities and economies are created by us and for us. We are part of what is created, whether or not we like it, what is. So really kind of emphasizing that connection to the fact that we are the economy. Often people see the economy as something so separate and out there. So I think that's a really valuable suggestion, Gail. And David says, a world where people have meaning, purpose and identity, a world where we are progressing and growing sustainably, a world where we are at ease and peace. I love the ease, because referring back to what we were talking about just then about ways of working. A resilient world, a world where people's lives are rich and fulfilling. We need videos and pictures of what it feel like.
Yeah.
That's also a very important point. I think people communicate in different ways, and often it's very powerful to have visual. It's like in Kate Raworth's book, Donut Economics, she talks a lot about the power of image to tell this new story, and that we need to not just tell it in words, but actually in pictures too. So thank you for that comment, David. And there's lots more. Yeah, we can read out a few snippets of them, but Katherine, do you have any scanning through and/or
it's so much, it's so extraordinary. And I mean, I think there's one from Lisa here talking about art and craft workshops, and I think that's, as someone who can't even draw a stick figure, I'm so useless at art, but I think it really talks about the different ways of reaching out to different people, that different mediums and mechanisms will resonate with different audiences, and which makes it very complex and messy and a lot of hard work and a lot to do, which is why I'm so grateful just seeing the flurry of activity that's just, in one sort of chat or one Zoom call, you already get a sense of the diversity of what's going on. So it's entirely, it's extraordinarily reassuring just to see, in 1 hour on a Zoom call, how much is happening in so many diverse places. And I think we need to really pull all those levers, whether it's arts and crafts, whereas policy wonks like me sort of writing papers and trying to communicate through mainstream media, whether it's others doing inspiring talks and sort of helping people think differently. It's a whole gamut of different activities, but also demonstrating what this looks like. And so I think the sort of practical manifestation of helping people feel what a wellbeing economy might look like and what it might feel like, and see that it's compelling, but also that it's possible and feasible, I think is really what's also, in an instrumental sense, really helpful. Because one of the greatest challenges to this agenda is that dismissive, oh, don't be naive, or it's impossible, or we can't do it any other way because we can't imagine it, or show us where it's perfectly happening. And it may not be happening at the scale of the system level, but it's certainly happening in microcosm. And so for policymakers, for example, or in business leaders who are inspired, this is not about stepping into the unknown, because we know what it looks like. We see it with the sort of chat and examples that we're seeing here today. And so it means that it'll get these sort of activities that folks on this call are doing has such a vital role in rebutting that pushback of don't be so naive. There is no alternative, because we can say, look, there is, and there, and there, and there. Yeah. So it's extraordinary. And that's part of why we call ourselves at WeAll the amplification team, because our job is to amplify all this work. So, just wonderful.
Yeah. And like you say, thank you so much, everyone, for all of your amazing contributions. And I think, it's so rich that I'm sorry that we don't have time to kind of touch on every comment, but like I say, everything that you're sharing will be downloaded and shared with Katherine and fed into WeAll's work. So I think it's really valuable. Just to touch on a few more that have been shared. Simon says, a world of flourishing, life with meaning and purpose, change making, so personally contributing to positive change beyond yourself. I think that kind of flourishing and meaningful flourishing and meaning resonated with quite a few people, and that's really powerful to see. I think that please feel free to continue sharing your reflections, because like I say, we will download the chat discussion afterwards. But just looking at the time, I'm going to move on to a few questions from the audience, because we did want to finish at around 7. So I will now move to the Q&A box, and we're going to run through a few of the questions. We don't have that much time left, because we've been having such a valuable discussion and wanted to bring in all of your guys' amazing contributions, but we'll try and get through as many of the questions as possible. So to start, the first question was posed by Murray McGrath early on.
Hi, Murray.
Murray says, it seems to me that the most important consideration for well-being is the feeling that a person has that his or her existence is significant. To what extent do I matter? Clifford Hugh Douglas in the 1920s identifies inequalities in the monetary system that could be improved by issuing to every citizen a dividend based on the country's economic performance, not from taxation, but from the source of money. This would bring a feeling of being recognised as an individual with status in society and lift the spirits. So Murray's question is, do you agree? And if so, do you see any way of bringing about this state of affairs?
Okay. Oh, so there's lots in that, Murray, as I would expect from someone as wise and as thoughtful as Murray. I think that the point at the quote he shared about people feeling that their existence is significant is so extraordinarily true and powerful, because at the moment we have an economy that treats people as just-in-time inventory, just sort of the same way a restaurant would order a bag of rice when it has a few extra bookings the next day, but then wouldn't order, just really sort of on demand when the businesses expect need individuals. We have people acting as sort of piece rate workers in the service economy, really not being treated as as human beings. And obviously people like Polanyi and David Harvey write about this really nicely. And I think in just some of those headlines I read out at the beginning, just from one day in the newspaper, show how that translates and how that manifests in, rising levels of, people using food banks and loneliness, and that we hear about rising levels of self-harm amongst young women, and yet we're in an economy that calls itself developed. So I think, Murray, it's an extraordinarily powerful reminder. And one of the things about a wellbeing economy is that it has to put the purpose back into people's lives, whether it's through their jobs, because that's a huge opportunity for people to feel sort of purpose and meaning, but also through other activities, feeling part of positive change, feeling that their work, even if it's unpaid, still really matters. And as we know, of course, that so much unpaid work is one of what really keeps the engines of other aspects of the economy going. And so there's lots of opportunities to do that. And I really think it starts with these amazing community organisations that are designed in a way that puts people first. That's their first priority, not seeing individuals as just an input that are disposable and they're at the beck and call of the needs of profit and dividends and shareholder returns. In terms of and speaking of dividends, in terms of you having a dividend to all citizens or communities, I think it's an extraordinary, exciting mechanism, and particularly when it's around perhaps democratising the ownership of wealth first and foremost. So we're not just having to rely on redistribution or healing of the hurt that the current economic model creates, putting sticking plasters over that harm. Instead, it's about sort of having the economy deliver first time round, if you like, so that, an economic model that is naturally sharing better, more democratic in terms of the ownership of wealth. And I think whether it's through basic income, whether it's through basic ownership of asset, sort of asset dividend as universal basic assets is another mechanism. So there's lots of different ways of doing that. I did the other thing that was in the paper today is that Finland is not going to continue their trial on the UBI. Now I need to read into that and find out why and what lessons are there. Obviously places like Scotland are just setting up some trials. So I think we really need to understand how to make such radical, in a way they shouldn't be radical, the idea that everyone deserves enough, but compared to current state of affairs, they are. I would say, and I just want to get this in because I think it's vital, when those schemes do not extend to the very, very most vulnerable, when they're all just about citizens in a formal sense, but folks like refugees and asylum seekers don't get them, then I think we really have to question, are they really going to the heart of how universal are they? So if anyone who's involved in working on projects to push out the UBI, then let's really make sure they're all encompassing, because otherwise their social justice credentials fall down a little bit.
Yeah, that's a very important point. And a few people reflected in relation to Murray's question and your response, Simon, saying that it does sound like universal basic income. So like you say, there are different ways to kind of approach this issue and address it, UBI being one. Gary Alexander says, following Murray's question, what about a kind of reputation system for serving people and planet that provides exactly that sense of significance? So anyone can have a kind of good reputation instead of chasing money and power.
Entirely.
Yeah.
So and I think in many communities that does exist.
Yeah.
And I think that's when you ask people what really matters to them, it is, generosity. It's about relationships. It's about working with others. It's about supporting others. And I think the challenge is that so much acts against acting in those behaviors. So, whether it's the way jobs are designed or whether the way businesses are designed. And so us sort of holding the line and keeping those sort of communities where what's good for people and planet is celebrated and rewarded, maybe not in a financial sense, but in an esteem sense, in a reputational sense, in a attraction sense, others just wanting to hang out with people who are like that. And I think in so many communities, that's what does happen.
Yeah, for sure. So I'm just aware of the time, and I would like to take one or two more of the questions that have been asked, just because it's really great to hear your views. But I just wanted to kind of check in with you, Catherine, maybe if we run 5 or 10
I'm
minutes
happy to
over.
keep going if other folks are.
And
Before folks go, though, I'm really happy if other things you want to let me know. Just, Twitter's probably the easiest way
yeah,
to
that's a
get in
really good
touch.
point. So maybe we'll just, as we're coming towards the hour, we'll say, okay, we'll take maybe 2 more questions from the Q&A box. But in terms of people that need to go on the hour, we'll send you a follow-up email with the recording of this webinar. We'll include the links of WeAll, Catherine's new organisation, Catherine's Twitter, so you can kind of stay in touch with her and ping her about any questions. And I will look into a way to I will download the chat and send it to Catherine, and I'll also look into a way of sharing that with all of you guys, because I think so many valuable projects and organisations have been shared that in the chat that haven't been able to be voiced, necessarily all of them, because of the richness of what you've been sharing. So yeah,
thank you. Before folks, I know folks have to go, so thank you ever so much.
Yeah.
Just extraordinarily grateful.
Yeah, and so we'll just take yeah, like I say, 1 or 2 more questions, and then we'll close for the folks that can stay. So Indra, who mentioned earlier from Alternative UK, she says, Catherine, what are the challenges for the political rhetoric of the wellbeing economy? Essentially, how can people be unplugged from the work to consume and replugged into a strong vision of the good life, which puts economic models to its service? Or she says, if the Green Party or Labour Party doesn't really mobilise or motivate, what political pitch would? So I think
so Indra, I'd love to work with you to try and answer that. That's not one I have a clean, ready to go question. I think it's part of our task is to really work out what mobilises voters, because ultimately we do need to get people to vote for this and help policymakers feel that they're not being brave, because we know it's a rare and very special politician who is, and there are some special politicians, and Indra works with some of them, so folks to learn more about that, do have a look at the Alternatives website and get behind that initiative. But I really recognise that there has to be a political project, and so we're really keen to work with organisations who are working in that space. One thing we're finding with the group of governments work that we're ploughing on with, and that's more at the sort of the governmental as opposed to political party level, which is a sort of slight difference, and obviously they're interrelated, but they're slightly different conversation. And one thing that's really attractive to the governments is that they're recognizing that they're not getting this all right, and so wanting to collaborate and learn from others. But what they're really also valuing, being part of this wider Wellbeing Economy Alliance grouping, so being sort of friends and cousins of the project, is the idea of us helping us, and I mean that with the sort of the broader sense of the term us, helping build that demand. One of our lead organisers, a woman who's really leading the work on the group of governments at the moment, she often talks about how when she was in government, she was able to be that much more ambitious when she was in international negotiations around climate change, for example, because she knew that so many citizens in her country were behind her. So she was confident to push the rhetoric. So I don't have the perfect answer, but it's something we need to work on and nail, because it's a key part of aligning that sort of regime space, the policy space, so that we can then start to open up a whole wider, yes, just seen your message, absolutely.
I think that in a way that's a beautiful point to end, because of time, and also because I think that touches upon the whole idea of bringing this webinar together and having Catherine as a guest to kind of make these valuable connections and provide spaces where we can work together on answering these difficult questions, because we're not going to do it in isolation. Actually, we need to support each other as organisations and as individuals, and I think it's really inspiring to see those discussions happening in this webinar, and I really hope that they will continue to happen in follow-up. So yeah, I just wanted to close by sharing a few very brief announcements. Like I've said already, the main practical things that we'll send the follow-up and ways to stay in touch with Katherine, and I would really recommend people to sign up to WeAll and watch this space about what their next steps
just
are.
to give us the current state of the website. Like I say, we've got all the ingredients still laid out. We haven't yet started making a beautiful cake, but be with us on that journey.
Yeah, I think, you know, in the way the content is the most important thing anyhow. So I think
just sign up for the moment and then come back to it.
Yeah, people will excitedly go to your website anyway. And yeah, as the Network of Wellbeing, we're going to continue this webinar series. And next month, on the 29th of May, we're going to have a webinar with Alex Nunn from Action for Happiness, we're going to be talking about happiness. Can happiness be used as a kind of agent towards wider social change? So I think that that will be an interesting discussion, because obviously there's some distinction between the discussions around happiness and well-being, and I think it will be interesting to delve into that next month. And we'll stay in touch with Katherine's work, and we look forward to sharing stuff in future on social media.
Can I say one tiny last thing?
Yeah, please do.
So folks wanting to, one of the questions that you harvested from Facebook as well, how can people be involved? And one obvious way is to also get involved in the organisations that will be part of the Wellbeing Economy Alliance and the Network for Wellbeing, who are hosting this call, and Flo and her colleagues Roger and Josh and so on, are key part of that. So really support those organisations too as best you can, as well as joining wider WeAll as we learn to walk and run and hopefully start bringing about that sort of connection and convening that we want to see.
Yeah, thank you so much, Katherine. That's really lovely of you, and I think it's just really great to be able to collaborate in this way. So thank you so much for your time and all of the inspiring words you've shared, and thank you again to everyone that's joined us this evening on the webinar, and anyone that's watched on Facebook Live, or if you're watching the recording again. It's really, really valuable to have you here with us, and all of the comments and work that's been shared. It's just been really overwhelming in a way. It's really motivating.
What a wonderful way to spend a Tuesday evening in London.
Exactly, yeah. So yeah, we'll all stay in touch, and we'll look out for the follow-up email in your inbox with further information.
Yeah. Thanks, folks.
Thanks very much, and thank you again, Katherine.
Pleasure. Well, I'm going to stay on though.
Yeah, that's fine.
We can have a little debrief. I'm going to start just having a quick read.
Me too.
Oh,